chapter 11. He says, "Then I was given a reed in verse 1 like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, those who worship there.'" We're in the altar now. We're in the worship center. We're in the temple. "But leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it's been given to the Gentiles. And they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies." So what happens? You go on to verse 7, and it says, "When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. Their bodies lie in Jerusalem for 3.5 days." And then what happens? They rise from the dead. So I want to make this connection before you. They are literally flat on their feet as humans in the corruptible flesh. They are flat on their feet, dead, bowing down, prostrate at the temple. They are representing the 2 stacks of bread on the table of showbread, one from the northern kingdom, one from the southern kingdom. And the 2 witnesses, go figure, are Moses and Elijah. The 2 witnesses that witness what? The resurrection of our Lord at the transfiguration. One on the left and one on the right. And would it interest you to find out that Moses is from the southern kingdom and Elijah is from the northern kingdom? One witness from each kingdom. They are the 2 candlesticks. If you ever want to know why we use candlesticks in my house, the 2 candlesticks on every Shabbat, it represents not just the light of God that we pass around the table in symbolism, but the 2 witnesses that Israel carries the torch. It carries the light of God. It is the 2 olive trees, the one that is cultivated and the one in Romans chapter 11, it says it's wild. Those 2 come together in the Jeremiah 11 olive tree, the one olive tree that was broken into 2. It is the 2 witnesses. So what's happening is this, is when they are cut, remember we talked about the 2 kinds of wheat, the wheat that is in the earth and the wheat that is not of the earth, the spiritual wheat. The wheat that is of the earth is corruptible. But when it is cut from the earth, it gets a new body. And so it is reached its full tamim, its full maturity. It is a full, perfect loaf before Yahweh. It is obtaining its destiny and its purpose. The 2 witnesses of Revelation are being offered before God, resurrected in their new bodies, being offered as perfect examples of what a believer is supposed to be like. The 2 witnesses of Revelation are the 2 loaves of bread. It is representing the one new man of Ephesians chapter 2. It is when we all get together in unity. How many know that you take the 3 braids of challah bread and you braid them together when you make bread? My daughters make the bread and they take the 3 braids, 3 separate pieces of bread, braid them together. When do they become one? When they go through fire. When they go into the oven, when they get heated up, and then when it comes out, it's beautiful. You have what? You have the transfiguration. What's standing at the transfiguration is Yeshua, Moses, and Elijah. And if you know the scriptures well enough, you know that the seal of God's people, the symbol of God's people, it says it is an olive tree and an olive tree and a lampstand in the middle. It is the menorah flanked by 2 olive trees, is the real symbol of all of Israel. It is the 3 braided challah bread. What is being offered floating above the earth on the transfiguration? None other than the holy bread, the 2 witnesses of Revelation, and the menorah right here. But first you have to die. in order to be resurrected, in order to be fully tamim, fully mature and complete, not lacking anything, you have to die. John 12:24, most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. Do you know why in the 7th sabbatical year they said, don't go and plant anything. Just eat from the fields. You go, wait a minute, how do you eat from the fields if you can't plant anything that year? Because in those days, there was no Monsanto. And so the grain, when it became fully mature, it dropped seeds for the next year. More seeds to actually last for 3 years, the Bible says. You see, true maturity in a believer will always replicate and duplicate itself multiple times over. And lastly, we're going to end with an anatomy class. Here's a beautiful, amazing thing, because God says that you are a seed. You are wheat. So let's look into the anatomy of a wheat grain. There are 3 parts to a wheat grain. There is the bran, or the outer hard shell. Then there's also the endosperm, which is the main part on the inside, carries vitamins and minerals. And the germ is the most significant and important part of the wheat seed, because it carries the fat and just a little bitty tiny microscopic drop of water and some other vitamins and minerals. It's where we get the term germination from. Without the germ, there is no breaking forth. So, do you find it interesting that this exact anatomy you can find in who you are? Because it is your human anatomy. The outer part of who you are is your flesh. No doubt about it. It's hard. What is God trying to do? Break through it constantly. Who you really are mostly on the inside is your soul, which is made up of your mind, will, and your emotions. But what germinates you, what causes you to die and break forth from the earth, is the Spirit. Every single human that's ever lived, the only reason why they're breathing is because Yahweh put the neshama, the breath, into the nefesh, the soul of Adam. It is the little fire, the little part of the Spirit of God. Every human has a little bitty part of the Spirit of God inside of them. This is what David calls deep cries to deep. So when someone hears the gospel, if you ever wonder, well, how did they respond? Why are they being stirred emotionally? Is because the fire of God on the inside of them that may be so squashed because it hasn't been able to germinate yet, but that germ, if you will, or the Spirit inside of you is relating to the Spirit. It's connecting to the deep. And that connection creates an umbilical cord which brings life inside of that person, causes them to surrender their life. And the moment they surrender, they're dead. And the moment they're dead, they're alive. This is the beginning life cycle of wheat. To live, you must die. And I hate to tell you that most people focus on salvation. I'm here to tell you that if Paul was standing on the stage, he would say, get over salvation, you got to die every day. You want to live tomorrow, you got to die today. Because you're not here to just live. Wheat is no good if it does not come to fruition and end up a loaf. It's nothing. It's worthless. Wheat is designed to grow, mature, and then be cut down, squashed, crushed. The chaff blown away by what? The wind of God. And sometimes God brings the wind in the form of a tornado. Because maybe He needs to knock your house off its foundation because the foundation needs to be inspected. Deuteronomy chapter 6. 3 more slides and then we're finished. Chapter 16, verse 10 says this. And thou shalt keep the feast of weeks unto the Lord. thy God with a tribute of a free will offering of thine hand, which thou shalt give unto the Lord thy God, accordingly as God has given you blessing. It's also a pilgrimage feast. Exodus 23:14 talks about 3 times a year you're supposed to come before the Lord. It says this, you shall celebrate a feast to me. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. And I commanded you. And the appointed time in the month of Aviv, for in it you came out of Egypt. And none shall appear before me empty hand. Not a single person, doesn't matter how poor they are, in ancient Israel, you could not come before God empty-handed. Also you shall observe the feast of harvest, of the first fruits of your labors, from which you sow in the field, in the feast of ingathering at the end of the year. So 3 times a year during the feast of Passover, feast of Shavuot, and the feast of Sukkot. All 3 of those, you're supposed to appear before God, and you can't appear before Him empty-handed. So how do we celebrate Shavuot? How does this all connect in the reality world? Number 1, just some basics. Number 1, you need to know it's a high Sabbath. It's a Sabbath. It's a Shabbat, which means that there's no work supposed to be done. Number 2, it's a holy convocation. It's a gathering of His people. Do you see that? Why do you think He calls it a gathering? What's going on during the feast of the first day of unleavened bread? The first day of unleavened bread is also a high Sabbath. And what's happening? There is a gathering of the sheaf. He's gathering His people together. Why? To wave before God as an offering. The feast of Shavuot, there's a gathering of His people again, together. Every time we gather, we're supposed to become a little more mature. A little bit more mature. So that one day, what's He going to do, ladies and gentlemen? Everybody in the Christian church calls it a rapture, and that it is. It is a cutting away from this earth. Have you ever wondered why the apostle uses the terminology? It's cutting away the wheat, but not just any wheat. It is the mature wheat that gets called the bride. The bride is the mature wheat. If you are not the mature wheat, you have more maturing to do. And that's what the tribulation is designed for. And I know I just hurt some of your feelings. Why does it say that? James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance be complete so that you may be may finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. The only way for you to become mature and complete is through tribulation, and that is exactly why the Great Tribulation exists. It's not for the pagans, ladies and gentlemen. They're already burning as we speak, according to the Scriptures. That's why He says, if you're going to judge the household of God. Don't judge unbelievers. They're already judged. If you're going to judge anybody, judge yourselves. To be mature. Trials and tribulation are for us so that we can be cut from this earth and actually be transformed into what we were called to be. A witness for our King. A loaf. And who eats that loaf? The high priest. How interesting. The high priest once stood on this earth, reclined, with His disciples and said, you must eat of me. And then the whole thing gets turned around because His whole point is if you eat of me, what's going down inside of you is what is going to germinate you to become like me. And one day you will be mature and complete and worthy to be at my table, and I will consume you. And all of you. We're to bring 2 loaves of leavened bread, and now you know why. It's not just some ancient ritual, it has beautiful symbolism. We're to bring an offering to the Lord. Besides the tithe that we bring normally, we're to bring an offering to the Lord based on how much the Lord's blessed you. So if the Lord's blessed you tremendously, you're supposed to bring something in proportion to that. It is out of the cheerful heart that this is supposed to happen. It's not obligation. He doesn't tell you how much to give. It's totally out of your heart. It's out of your maturity. How much grain do you have? And last but not least, the Torah leads to legalism, ladies and gentlemen. without the Spirit, without the water. And the Spirit leads to emotionalism and denominationalism without the instructions of God. Yahweh has designed the wheat to die, raised from the dead, but that's not enough. And I submit to you that's where we've stopped in the Christian church. Is we get excited when we see a wheat field full of little baby wheats. If you know anything about agricultural and animals, you will discover that the most attractive food source for predators that eat plants are baby plants. They're soft. I'm a deer hunter, therefore I'm protecting the wheat. Deer eat, and all these animals eat what comes up right off the bat. That's why they got to be together. Protect them against the wolves and those that would feed upon them. We can't just stop at 2 inches. We've got to grow. The deer do not eat, and the animals don't eat mature wheat. They only eat it when it's grain. So the more you mature in Yahweh and His Word, the less the enemy can touch you. And the more attractive you become to the King. Stand with me.